So the accumulation of methylene blue in the mitochondria is really where the magic happens, because what methylene blue is doing is it's one of these compounds very unique in that it helps you make more energy in your mitochondria, which is the powerhouse, the energy production center of your cell.
Hey, this is Ari. Welcome back to the podcast. With me today is my friend, Dr. Scott Sherr, who has been on the podcast one time previously, and he is one of the world's top experts in hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and just a wonderfully smart and brilliant guy all around on a number of other topics, including one that he's gone very deep in recent years, which is methylene blue, the world's oldest drug, and how this can be used to optimize your energy levels as well as your brain function. He's gone very, very deep on this subject. He knows a ton. I asked him some very challenging questions, and I think his answers were excellent, in my personal opinion. So with no further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode with Scott Sherr on methylene blue. Dr. Sherr, it is a pleasure to connect with you again, my friend. It has been way too long.
All right. Yeah, likewise, man. I hope you're enjoying Costa Rica.
I am. So
And the surf.
A lot's changed since we last spoke and we last
Indeed.
hung out in person. You're living in Colorado. I'm living in Costa Rica. Both of us have been exiled from California.
Voluntarily.
Exactly.
Or maybe involuntarily on some level, but mostly voluntary. Yes. Yeah.
So you have also started a new company. Your expertise, for people listening, has historically been in the realm of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. You've had a clinic in Northern California, and you now serve as a consultant for hyperbaric clinics all over the world.
Indeed, yeah.
And you're considered a renowned expert in that topic. One of the other areas that you've delved into very deeply is something you dosed me with last time I hung out, which was methylene blue.
Mm-hmm. We have a habit of doing that. Yes. Yeah.
Methylene blue is a really interesting substance. I'll let you tell the sort of maybe the official history of it, but my personal history of it is that I've been using methylene blue since I was like 12 years old.
Really?
Yeah, because when I was young, I was very into aquariums, and methylene blue is commonly used before the more recent craze of humans using it to enhance their brain and mitochondrial function. It was commonly used to treat certain diseases in aquarium, in fish in aquariums. So I've been using it and staining my skin with it for almost 30 years at this point.
There you go. Yeah.
So
excellent.
But there's an interesting history, of course, much beyond my own personal history here, of methylene blue more broadly. So what is this substance? Where did it come from?
Yes, we had some really great headlines for our company, like actually within the pandemic, maybe about a year in, how biohackers and high performers were using fish tank cleaner to optimize their health. Great clickbait headline. And it plays into the history of methylene blue. So yes, it is used as fish tank cleaner. It still is used in that way. However, there's lots of better ways of getting your methylene blue, I promise, if you're going to be taking it as a human, not as a fish.
Actually, the headline was exaggerated. It's misguided. So I can tell you, as an aquarium expert or ex-aquarium expert, it's not a fish tank cleaner. It is actually a treatment, a medication for specific diseases on fish, and like treatment of parasites.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And fungal infections, et cetera. Yeah. And so that's how methylene blue got started. Actually, before it became a medical treatment or a medical therapy, it was actually used as a dye in textile manufacturing. This is in the mid 1800s. It was dyeing blue jeans. It was the first dye that we used to actually dye blue jeans the color blue. But somehow, and we're not really sure, in South Africa in the 1880s, they figured out that it treated malaria. I don't know how, but they figured out that high doses of methylene blue orally would treat malaria. And so as a result of that, more studies were done and more interest of using methylene blue in an antimicrobial capacity started coming to the fore. So between 1897, when it was the first drug that was registered with the FDA at that time, until about 1950, it was the only antimicrobial around, really. And so they used it for urinary tract infections. They gave it to World War II pilots and soldiers that were in the Pacific theater that they had to use prophylactically, and when they were in the jungles in the Pacific, for example. because it treated things like trench foot and fungal infections, parasitic infections, and it treated it really well. The major side effect, as you were kind of alluding to, Ari, is that it does dye things blue, and it also concentrates in your urine. So you urinate blue or bluish color, depending on how much you have. And so they used to have all these World War II songs about peeing blue and all these kinds of things as a result of the airmen and things having to take methylene blue all the time. So in the 1950s, when antimicrobials came around, methylene blue became out of favor. However, it became a much more prominent use in the fish tank world, in fish tank cleaner, or for treating fish tank or fish infections, as you described it. Mm-hmm. And it was around that time also that a lot of studies were being done on methylene blue, as it became the first antipsychotics, actually, the first antipsychotic drugs were derived from methylene blue, something called chlorpromazine, which is a kind of like our old school antipsychotic that used to shoot people up with that were going through psychotic breaks. It was derived from methylene blue. And not only that, they'd actually include methylene blue in antipsychotic drugs after that, because that's how they would be able to tell if the patients were taking their antipsychotics. If they were actually peeing blue, they knew that they were taking this particular, they were taking their antipsychotic along with the compounded methylene blue with it together, basically. So you had this antimicrobial capacity, and then you had this antipsychotic capacity. And actually, a lot of drugs were derived from methylene blue that are still on the market today in the sort of antipsychotic world. And that, as a result of its work in a particular capacity called an MAOI inhibitor. It basically is called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So very mildly, it increases serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine in the synapse. So it gives you a bit of a mood boost on its own. Mm-hmm. And then over the last several decades, this is when it's become very interesting to people in the performance world, in people in the health and wellness field, basically, because what do we know? Methylene blue also has been used for a stain for many, many decades. So laboratory people, if everybody's been in a laboratory before, they probably used methylene blue at some point to stain. And what does it stain? It actually stains your mitochondria. And that's when things got really interesting, is when we realized that it was staining the mitochondria itself.
Okay, so what is the significance of that? Why is it being, I guess, a way of phrasing that, to say it's staining the mitochondria is to say that it's being bioaccumulated,
yes,
or concentrated by the mitochondria,
right?
And so,
exactly,
what's going on there?
So the accumulation of methylene blue in the mitochondria is really where the magic happens, because what methylene blue is doing is it's one of these compounds very unique in that it helps you make more energy in your mitochondria, which is the powerhouse, the energy production center of your cell. But at the same time, it actually increases antioxidant capacity. Now, most things that give us more energy, hyperbaric therapy being one of them, actually, is going to create a lot more stress on the system, a lot more what we call reactive oxygen species, because the more energy you make, the more waste products or the byproducts of energy metabolism that you get. And these are called reactive oxygen species. They're called it's called oxidative stress, free radicals. These are all words that Ari and your audience are very used to, given your work. Okay. But it's okay to have these in small amounts, because our body has a natural ability to increase antioxidant reserve. And we have all these enzymes that get induced as a result of this additional oxidative stress. However, in a significant amount of people these days that are already under a decent amount of oxidative stress because of mitochondrial dysfunction, because of inflammation, infection, post-infectious, autoimmunity, et cetera, like they don't have that ability to increase that antioxidant reserve. And so you kind of give them the ability to make more energy, but then you have all this oxidative stress that the body can't tolerate. And that's when they feel worse than they did before. And this is something that I found actually in the world of hyperbaric therapy back in when I started. If I was giving them a lot more oxygen, making them a lot more energy, but they couldn't detox well from it, they would be in a whole world of hurt, basically, in the end, and they wouldn't see the benefits. So what methylene blue is able to do is not only increase the amount of energy you make, it also increases your antioxidant reserve at the same time. And on the energy side of things, this is super interesting and kind of nerdy, but if you have mitochondria that aren't working that well, like you have 4 complexes on it that are called the electron transport chain. If the first 2 aren't working that well, you don't make energy well, because that's how those first 2 complexes are taking electrons from your food and making things like NAD and FAD, okay? But if those aren't working that well, you're not going to feel good. But methylene blue can actually bypass those first two complexes. So if you're not making energy from the food that you're eating, because those complexes aren't working that well, you can bypass it with methylene blue, continue to make energy, or regenerate the energy producing machinery, even if those aren't working that well at the same time.
Mm-hmm. How does it do that?
So it does that by donating electrons to something, the fourth complex in the mitochondria called cytochrome oxidase. And so cytochrome oxidase is called complex 4. And so what methylene blue does is it induces genes that make more of that particular complex, but it also just donates electrons directly to it. So the electron transport chain, real quick, is just an energy gradient. It's just a gradient that's created in your mitochondria so that you can make energy. And so what you need for that to happen is what are called electrons. And these come off our food, but they can come off molecules like methylene blue that donate electrons to the electron transport chain, induce the gradient, and then allow you to make more energy. And so that's how it's working. And interestingly enough, there's other things that also donate electrons to the complex 4. And one of the major things is actually red light. Near infrared light does the same thing. So photon energy, 660 nanometers, well described, well researched, also donates electrons to your electron transport chain via photons, via the electron transport chain and cytochrome oxidase, so complex 4. So this is why we can use them together, actually, for many people, where you can synergize the work of a red light therapy, for example, and methylene blue together and see an enhanced effect. I mean, you can just go out in the sun and go surfing in Costa Rica, or you could have a red light device, of course, that does 660 nanometers specifically.
Or you could have both. Not saying I know anybody who does that, but
not saying that I know anybody here that has that either. Although I don't have as much sun here in Colorado as you. Well, it's
you
stronger
get
though.
Good sun at altitude. You get the nice
so
spectrum of UV up at altitude.
Yeah, definitely. I'm at 5,000-ish feet. So actually, from the longevity research, which you probably know, there's like a sweet spot around 4,000 or 5,000 feet. So that's obviously why I moved here. So
yeah, there's interesting anti-aging effects. I had debates with Dr. Jack Kruse about this many years ago, because he was, this is a bit of a digression, but he was railing against altitude, living at altitude, as being very harmful to health, and talking about the benefits of being at sea level. And I have no vested interest, no fight in this whatsoever, like no bias.
Sure.
I live at sea level. I have no bias towards arguing about the health benefits of altitude. But I went and looked at the literature, and I just found study after study after study showing that living at altitude was in fact protective of many different diseases, and was Colorado, where you live, was associated with some of the longest lifespans of any state in the United States. And the lowest rates of many different diseases. But
that does play into our topics a little bit here, because we're talking about energy production on some level, right? If you have mild hypoxia, so you're mildly, like at a higher altitude, right? We have less oxygen up here. I have 16% oxygen here compared to sea level, which is 21% oxygen. So over the long term, as the body has to recalibrate to the higher altitude, there are some factors that likely play into longevity. But the challenge that actually I find is that, and you know this as well, Ari, if you come to altitude, it's a big deal, right? Because if you initially come to altitude, you don't have enough oxygen, you don't have enough oxygen in the air, you don't have enough red blood cells to carry the oxygen, you have all these things that are happening with something called your oxygen dissociation curve. And so interestingly though, methylene blue might be one of those things that can help people, because it helps continue the process of making energy, even if there's not as much oxygen around, which is pretty interesting. Because what happens here is that when we're increasing more energy, what we're also doing is stimulating the whole system to say, oh, now we need to make more energy. So the mitochondria are working more. And so as a result of that, you dilate blood vessels, you get more oxygen to that tissue, and you actually increase something called nitric oxide to do that. And you're also enhancing glycolysis, or basically the breakdown of our food, our glucose, into the component parts to go into our mitochondria to help you make more energy. So it seems to be an altitude remedy for many people. We're also using it for jet lag for those that are flying for long distances and are at low oxygen concentrations when they're flying, for example. We have some jet lag protocols that I've developed with Dr. Ted and others at our company that we really do see a significant benefit for people that are looking to just increase their energy production when there's not as much energy to be made because they're at high altitude, for example. Mm-hmm. On the other end of that, on the antioxidant side of things, is also super interesting, because we know that it's actually radiation protection. So like we know that if you use methylene blue, it's going to protect you from radiation. If you're at a higher altitude, if you're on an airplane, for example, you're getting more radiation when you're up on, in an airplane, for example, at 35,000 feet, of course. At the same time, we also know there is some protection in the skin if you use methylene blue even orally, because it enhances antioxidant capacity. It's maybe as strong as something like vitamin C and glutathione for this in some of the skin studies out there. And so we're using it in that capacity as something that enhances antioxidant reserve. And like a lot of people that
orally or topically?
Both, actually, both. So there are companies that are using it topically,
Yeah.
and there are companies like myself that are using it orally. And it seems to work. I mean, there's definitely some companies that are using it topically, but the challenge, as we've been discussing with methylene blue, is it is a stain. So it is going to stain, and so getting it to a point where it doesn't stain your skin blue, and you don't look like a Smurf, but it still can be effective is still kind of a question on my mind.
Right.
So I think the way I think about using it is usually more systemically, and as giving the systemic optimization, the systemic bump for antioxidant reserve that way.
Okay, so there's a subtlety of how you're speaking, which I greatly appreciate, and it's very unusual to hear people speak with this nuance, and I want to delve into this more so people understand it. You're talking about increasing antioxidant reserve as distinct from a compound acting as a direct antioxidant. So
correct.
This is a distinction that I find is I think one of the big sort of health secrets that exists today. Very few people, including very few practitioners, I found actually understand this well. There are many compounds which are framed as which are framed as antioxidants, which are not actually antioxidants, which are actually pro-oxidants, which have an indirect antioxidant effect.
Sure.
Many different phytochemicals, things like sulforaphane, for example,
these are hormetic stressors.
Fall into this category. People refer to it as an antioxidant, but it's actually a pro-oxidant that interacts with our internal antioxidant defense systems in a way that helps build them up to a more robust state. Exercise is also in this way can be an indirect antioxidant by being a powerful oxidant, a powerful source of increasing these reactive oxygen species. It then builds up our internal antioxidant system more into a strengthened state. Conversely, there is quite a bit of concern, and I've spoken to some experts in the biochemistry of this, of excessive use of true direct antioxidants as down-regulating, basically having the opposite effect of exercise or sulforaphane or some of these other things, down-regulating the internal antioxidant defense system. So let me summarize this. The simplistic narrative that most people in the general public and most practitioners subscribe to, which is wrong, is the basic idea that oxidants are bad, antioxidants are good, and we got to get rid of these bad guys, minimize them. Of oxidants, we got to, antioxidate them as much as possible and suppress them and eliminate them, and use as much antioxidants as possible. And that's reinforced, of course, through all the marketing within natural health, and companies that produce antioxidant supplements have indoctrinated the general public into that paradigm for many decades now. Everybody accepts it as true. And I would say 99% of even practitioners and functional medicine doctors still subscribe to that sort of basic paradigm. You are part of the exception to that rule in the way that you're describing things, because you're aware of everything I just said, and you know that there is actually an internal regulatory system of oxidants and antioxidants, that our body intentionally produces plenty of oxidants, which are not bad, but actually serve many vital roles in our body, and produces its own supply of antioxidants, and that these need to be regulated in the proper balance to one another, rather than just supplying lots of antioxidants to kill off the bad guys. The oxidants. So the way you're talking about methylene blue is as something that increases antioxidant reserve, But commonly online, you will find people talking about it as a direct antioxidant.
Correct. Yeah.
And let me add one more layer to this, just to further complicate things, which is that we also know that when it synergizes with red light at 660 nanometers, that this is often used to create an antimicrobial effect due to
Yes.
the production of free radicals. So let's delve into this story. So
Okay.
what is the truth about methylene blue in regards to, is it an antioxidant? Is it an oxidant or an antioxidant, or how is it functioning in human physiology?
So, I mean, that's wonderfully said, Ari. I would say that it's actually both, which is that's the crazy thing about it. So it can induce an antioxidant response because of creating more energy, but it also itself can carry or pick up free electrons, which are what reactive oxygen species are, and get reduced. When methylene blue gets reduced, so oxidized is usually free electrons. Reduces means you're grabbing those electrons. You're no longer as volatile, basically, and not as oxidized. They're not oxidized. They're not volatile. They're reduced. Oxidize, reduced, oxidize, reduced. That's all we're doing really in the mitochondria at all times. Okay. So what methylene blue does is it actually changes from being a blue pigment to being colorless when it goes to a reduced form. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is that you can actually titrate somebody's dose to how blue their urine is in some ways. And now this has not been studied yet, but it works, and it's been working with some of my practitioner colleagues that I've worked with the products that we have, is that the more stressed you are, the more that you need to give your mitochondria support. The less stressed you are, the less you need. So if like I have a dose that I take regularly, and then I have a dose that I take when I'm traveling, it's often going to be higher because I'm not sleeping as well. I'm under radiation exposure, but I have protocols for all this stuff, but I can actually titrate my dose, knowing that methylene blue can work in both capacities is what it comes down to. It can work as an energy enhancer, and it works as an antioxidant reserve piece where it can give you more antioxidant reserve. So if you're creating more oxidative stress, which you are because of using more methylene blue, you're also able to neutralize that at the same time. And that's the beauty of this compound. And so that's why I call it an antioxidant reserve, because if you don't need it, it's not going to give you more. It's only going to be there if you need it. And so that's what's beautiful about it. It's sort of a self-regulatory mechanism. And the thing about methylene blue too is, as we said, it concentrates in your mitochondria. And so you have the most mitochondria in where? Your brain, your heart, your liver, and your muscle tissue. And so we're working with endurance athletes as well that are using methylene blue because it's increasing their energy production capacity in their mitochondria, in their muscle tissue as well, and also building up that antioxidant reserve. So the hormetic stress still happens, but you still have extra antioxidant reserve so you can make gains faster. And so that's another interesting way that you can see this cycle. There's very few other compounds that do this. And you made a good point, though, just to reiterate what you said at that very last piece there, is that we are using higher dose methylene blue with red light, for example, as an antiviral, as an antibacterial, as an antimicrobial. That's usually greater than about 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight. Now, our dosing at my company at Transcriptions is much lower than that, because we're really looking at allowing the body to use it as it needs to, in the sense of making more energy, increasing antioxidant reserve. But if you need to have more acute need for the energy production or the oxidation piece, or the piece of trying to increase antioxidant reserve, then you want to go higher dosing, and then think about, for infections and even for ischemic events and things like that, where they've done some interesting studies as well.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about dosing, but
Yeah.
a couple things before we get there. One is I actually did a bit of a dive into the literature recently to find if there's any studies on methylene blue use in the context of athletic performance. So it's funny that you just brought that up. I found almost nothing, almost no research that exists on that topic, which is surprising for a compound that's existed for so many decades and that acts on these mitochondrial pathways. It seems very odd to me that no one has thought to study it in the context of exercise performance. What have you found in your experimentation with athletes on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been surprising to us too, just knowing what we know about how this particular compound works. And I think one of the challenges with methylene blue is that it's been around for such a long time that it's forgotten about because it's not the new sexy drug on the block
Yeah.
that everybody's looking at. It's off patent. So it's not like a pharmaceutical company can take methylene blue, put their label on it and charge $1 million for it. Now, there are companies, though, that are looking at methylene blue and derivatives of it. We discussed this for antipsychotics. They're using this now for Alzheimer's disease. There's a new study, I think it's in like stage 3 trials, where they're looking at 16 milligrams of methylene blue, or a compound very similar to it, in Alzheimer's trials, right? So they're using it and trying to change it in various ways for Alzheimer's, for cancer, because that's what drug companies do.
So they can patent it.
So they can patent it and they can charge, exorbitant amounts of money to make their margins and everything else. Mm-hmm. The challenge with methylene blue is that it's been around such a long time and the resurgence of interest has only happened in the last couple decades. Mm-hmm. And there was a researcher down in Austin. His name is Francisco Gonzalez Lima, and he's published many studies on methylene blue in cognitive models of Alzheimer's, basically. And so he's got some really interesting work that he's done. And he's also done some studies on red light exposure along with methylene blue at low doses for cognitive enhancement. Mm-hmm. There's many studies that have looked at methylene blue for infection over the years, but you don't have a lot in the performance world. But what I can tell you is that we've been working with athletes. I've been working with them specifically on my end. Their endurance times go up and their recovery times go up too. And so you can use it in different ways. You can use methylene blue as something you take before you do something as an endurance enhancer. But if you decide to use it afterwards, it also can help with after the hormetic stress of the actual activity. Then you use methylene blue as a way to help recover faster so that you can do more work the following day. And not to mention, as we talked about earlier, it's also an MAOI inhibitor. So it increases these neurotransmitters a little bit. They're dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. So you feel better when you're doing your exercise. And I have a couple of clients that refuse to work out without it because they just feel so much better when they're doing it, and they can keep their heart rate more elevated while they're doing it. Mm-hmm. This is, anybody from my athletes that are marathon runners to my moms that are on their treadmills when their kids go to school. I mean, and everything in between. And this is not only just for well people. I think that's really important too. Like we're working with a lot of patients. I'm working with a lot of patients, and a lot of our practitioners that are using our products are using that are using our products for people with chronic inflammation, with autoimmunity, with everything that goes around those kinds of diagnoses, like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue and all the things that you specialize in, Ari. Because if you're giving mitochondrial support, everything becomes easier, especially at the lower doses of the scale of using methylene blue, is what we found.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. And linking things back up with the earlier conversation about acting as a direct antioxidant or not, that's also relevant to combining it with exercise, because we know that the use of direct antioxidants
not a good idea.
In tandem with exercise often actually inhibits many of the beneficial effects of exercise. So that's a concern I always had with methylene blue. If it is acting as a direct antioxidant, then maybe it's actually inhibiting the benefits of exercise if you take it too close to that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking at that. I think a lot of it depends on the dose as well. So because the higher the dose, the more antioxidant reserve you're going to create in the system. So lower dose. And so I use this in the hyperbaric context as well, thinking about, well, do we want to give too many antioxidants right away if you're going to do a hormetic stressor, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of it depends on the person. So if you have somebody that has chronic inflammation, autoimmunity, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, they're already under stress and they want to go do exercise, that's going to make it worse for a lot of these patients, right? And you've had this experience many times over, as I have as well, hyperbarics or not. And so if you can give them a little bit of antioxidant, a little bit of energy production, a little bit of antioxidant exposure ahead of time, they tend to do better, and then they can do more work, and then they can continue on that progress. And so that's what I'll typically do. Is it really is focused on the individual, on the person that you're looking at and working with, and saying, okay, this person is under a lot of oxidative stress already. Let's give them a little bit of methylene blue ahead of time, as opposed to like your elite athlete. You may think that they're not under a lot of oxidative stress, but they are, because most of these people are overtraining. They're not sleeping as well as they need to. And so they're usually under more oxidative stress than you actually can realize. And so some of my most highly inflamed people that I work with are elite athletes, actually, that are just about to fall off that cliff. So I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about dosing briefly, because many years ago, when I first started not playing with methylene blue for my fish tank, but playing with methylene blue for myself, the common recommendations that were out there were to use doses that were, I forget the exact numbers, but very, very small doses, in the neighborhood of like 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 milligrams per day. And it was like 0.1 milligram per kilogram ish. And I kind of accepted that as fact or as, based on good
The latest
science.
research. Yeah.
And then I decided at some point to delve into the research and start looking at some of the studies myself. And I started finding these animal studies with vastly higher dosages. I mean, talking about maybe in animals, it's like 4 or 5 milligrams per kilogram, something like that. And then in humans, there were many human studies where they were using 1, or I want to say roughly 1, maybe on average 1 milligram per kilogram per body weight. And so here I was experimenting with, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 milligrams, thinking that I was like taking a big dose. I remember taking 4 drops or 5 drops thinking, wow, this is a really big dose. And then I found these studies saying that, there were 10 and 20 times higher dosages that are being used in the studies on depression, or in the studies on various diseases where these methylene blue's been studied. So then I started experimenting with a bit higher doses, but I'm curious what you guys have settled on as far as ideal dosing parameters.
Yeah, a lot of it depends on what you're using it for, as you were kind of alluding to, in the sense of we have higher dosing, which is typically on the average of about greater than 1 milligram per kilogram body weight in the antiviral acute ischemic kind of world. Those doses can be very effective, but you don't want to take them for long periods of time because they do have potential side effects. I mean, the major side effects would be, so we're using that high a dose for things like infection, for example, or gut biofilms. So Bartonella is one of the more common co-infections in Lyme. It's being used more commonly, methylene blue is, as a synergistic tool, but it's affecting gut biofilms. So at higher doses, you are going to start killing off things that you don't want to kill in your gut, is what we think. There's also a higher risk of gastric ulceration at higher doses of oral forms. And in addition, the other thing you have to think about is the half-life of methylene blue. So methylene blue's half-life is about, which means how much of the drug is going to be about half the potency in a certain amount of time, is about 4 to 6 hours. So if you're taking a very high dose, like 100 milligrams a day, which some people are, which I don't recommend, is that's going to build up in the system over time. And that's going to cause, pure oxidation at some point. So you're not going to get any of the benefits. You're just going to get although oxidation is not necessarily a detriment, but if it's over-oxidized, it can cause a significant downregulation or just dysregulation of the system. So 1 milligram per kilogram is sort of where a lot of that work has been done. But where a lot of the newer work is being done is at lower dosing for more mitochondrial optimization, for brain optimization, nootropic function, so brain optimization function. So when we were creating dosing, we wanted to create a dose that was more in line with the nootropic capacity of methylene blue. And because we knew that if that was the case, that was very likely going to be the sweet spot for what we've been describing before, which is this electron cycling capacity, energy production, antioxidant reserve. So I call it, energy and resilience. You're giving you energy and resilience at the same time. And so that's why I was alluding to some of the studies earlier on the 16 milligram dosing. And so that's when we decided to create a troche, which is a dissolvable lozenge that goes between your upper cheek and gums, dissolves there, or you can swallow, actually, if it's just pure methylene blue itself, because methylene blue is so highly bioavailable. The thing that we made these troches for our company because troche is a really great delivery device to create a direct vascular diffusion into your brain, basically from up in your cheek. And it's highly vascular in here. So it works faster if you do it that way, but you can still swallow them as well. The other reason is actually in some of the other products that we have, some of the ingredients are not as highly bioavailable, which means that they'll get digested by the system, by the liver, and make them less active or deactivate them. So if you dissolved in your mouth, it doesn't happen. So we have two products that have a combination of things that are better dissolved in the mouth for that reason. But methylene blue in a troche form is, whether you swallow it or whether you dissolve it in your mouth, it's still going to get all in your system, because methylene blue is one of those other interesting molecules, very few like this, that are very highly bioavailable. No matter if you swallow it, if you get it in the IV, it's almost the same, which is very unusual. Most things, if you get orally, if you take orally, like N-acetylcysteine, for example, is only about 10% bioavailable, which means that 90% of it gets deactivated by your liver. But if you take it IV NAC, it's 100% bioavailable. So I don't recommend that, but just as an example, for people. But anyway, so we used the 16 milligram dosage because of what was being studied in Alzheimer's disease. And our troches are very easy to dose instead of the drops, which are very difficult to dose, as you probably remember, and they're very, very messy. You can take our troches and cut them into quarters, into halves, or take a full troche. And I've been surprised, Ari. I mean, some people will get massive effect with just a 4 milligram square of our full troche. And I think it depends on their mitochondrial optimization status and also what they need, in the sense that, like, sometimes you just want to give a little bit of support when people are really sick as well. You don't want to give a whole lot because it's going to cause more dysregulation potentially as well. So that's how we got to our dosing, which is, very low dose. It's less than 0.5 milligrams per kilogram. But there are reasons to use higher dosing, as I described.
Okay. So lower dosing is, you're going to see more of the mitochondrial enhancing, brain enhancing effects.
Right. And synergy with red light as well in that capacity. But if you want to go higher dose, like higher methylene blue, in the kind of COVID world, post-COVID world, we were using a lot of these things, even though we weren't supposed to. And we were helping a lot of people in combination with red light and high dose methylene blue and hyperbaric oxygen therapy and all these things that we couldn't talk about, or else we would all, get sued or fired or whatever. That's why you live in Costa Rica, right? Nobody can touch you now, right? So, but anyway, so for me, this is all a big deal as a clinician. But we do know that lower doses of methylene blue with red light is a fantastic mitochondrial optimization synergizing thing. So,
okay, let's talk more about that piece. Why is it synergistic? Because what I've seen, there's plenty of research on the fact that there is some kind of interesting synergy between methylene blue and red light, specifically at 660 nanometers.
Right.
And typically what we find research on is the production of singlet oxygen, free radicals, basically, that end up being selectively toxic to, for example, viruses. And there's even research on this in the context of COVID and using in blood transfusions, taking the blood and putting methylene blue in it, irradiating it with red light, and it killing the COVID, SARS-CoV-2 virus, among many, many other studies.
Right, and other viruses too.
And also in photodynamic therapy in the context of cancer, being selectively toxic to cancer cells. Right. So there is this, again, methylene blue, red light synergy, production of free radicals, toxicity to these harmful things, viruses, cancer cells, and so on. But the way that I'm hearing a lot of people talk about it now is that there's sort of this allusion to like a magical sort of synergy. Yeah, the red light activates the methylene blue and makes it better, makes it more effective at boosting your brain function or your energy levels and so on, which I'm open to, the idea that that's true. I just don't know the scientific mechanisms that underlie that. So is it a hormetic effect from the production of free radicals, or what's going on there?
It is simply a synergistic effect in the sense that they're both working on the same complex in the mitochondria. That's all we know. In the sense that, so if you have energy coming and being produced because you have more red light, you're going to get more energy produced also because you have methylene blue around at the same time. So that's all the research that we have thus far, at least at low doses. And that's why we think people, will subjectively feel better when they're using them in combination. So I do not think that the oxidative load piece is really playing a huge part in this at the lower doses of methylene blue. In fact, it might be that because we're using it at low doses, we're neutralizing some of that oxidative stress that's happening in a very like almost like equal kind of term in the sense that you don't have a lot of stress that's happening because you don't have as much methylene blue around or as high of intensity red light or photodynamic therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you had it at higher intensity photodynamic therapy, red light, or in your higher dosed methylene blue, that's when you're going to create more of these singlet oxygens as you're describing. And that's how it's being used in things like cancer and infection. So I think that's the difference, is that lower dose, you're have enough capacity either on your own right because of your antioxidant reserve, along with methylene blue, to protect you from stress from that system, from that synergistic effect, I think.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah.
When it comes to the brain side of this and the altering of levels of neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin in the brain and MAO inhibition, do you see any potential consequence for long-term use? Like, for example, the chronic use of caffeine, the most widely used drug in existence, absolutely has massive negative effects on neurotransmitters systems in the brain with chronic use. With short-term use, acute use, or intermittent use, it works wonderful to create those short-lived effects. But when you use it, especially multiple times a day, every day, you really disrupt the adenosine system in the brain in a way where it becomes dysregulated and you have side effects. Most people are, of course, unaware of what those side effects are. But for people listening, it lowers your baseline levels of energy and mood and cognitive function, and makes you dependent on the caffeine in order to function normally. But
and screws your hormones up over time and things like that too.
Yeah. So do you see any issue like that occurring with methylene blue?
Well, a couple of things come up. I think the first thing that I'd like to describe is something that we call at our company health optimization nootropics versus performance optimization nootropics. So Dr. Ted, who you know is the founder of the Transcriptions Company, Dr. Ted Achikosa, a very smart guy, been using methylene blue, nicotine, caffeine, all these other kinds of ingredients that we use in our products for various reasons and multiple years before they were cool, kind of thing. And what we realize, though, is that the definition nootropic is really focused on the performance side. So people think of nootropics as something that's going to help make them perform better. But what they don't think about is it something that's healthy for the brain, or is it something that's going to clock your brain over time? So a good example of a performance optimization nootropic, you just nailed it, is caffeine. Caffeine enhances the production or the release of a number of neurotransmitters. It plays with the adenosine receptors and the adenosine pathways, and it does all these kinds of things to the brain and hormonal systems as well. So in the short term, it can help you make more energy, make you feel more awake and alert. But over the long term, it can clock the system and make things dysregulate. Same goes with another product that we use in one of our products called blue cannatine. We use nicotine in that one, and we use nicotine and caffeine along with CBD and methylene blue and something called blue cannatine that helps with focus, concentration. Like it's your Adderall equivalent basically without the jitters, and it's fantastic for 3 to 5 hours. But is it something you want to use all the time? The answer is no, because it has these performance optimizing nootropics in there, like nicotine and caffeine, that are great for short-term benefits, or maybe even some long-term benefits. But over the long term, it can still be an issue. Now, the thing about methylene blue is it actually has both capacities. As we were describing before, just now actually with the neurotransmitter release, this is what I would put into the category of performance optimizing, because it's increasing serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine in your synapse. So it's increasing your energy production systems as a result of that. But at the same time, it's increasing energy production in your mitochondria directly, as we described in detail already. And it's also increasing antioxidant reserve. So it's not necessarily just a performance optimization nootropic, but it's also got health optimizing capacity as well. So it's protecting the system at the same time as it's helping make more energy. So this goes along with its use in our blue cannatine, for example. We use methylene blue in there because it's got both capacities. And we use CBD in there too, because CBD as well has what we would call a health optimization nootropic capacity. It's increasing the production or the circulating numbers or the amount of something called anandamide, which is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for bliss and for decreasing inflammation, et cetera. So what it comes down to is that we think that methylene blue is protecting itself from itself, basically, because it's got this ability to cycle, to increase antioxidant reserve. So I don't see it as an issue over the long term. Now, of course, you want to measure what people need over time. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to take methylene blue for the rest of their life either. I think that it's something that can be great as something that people use regularly for health optimization. But I also think it's really helpful when people have a lot of inflammation, a lot of antioxidant need, and they have a lot of, they have brain fog, they're dealing with long COVID symptoms, they're having lots of inflammation, and it can be used in low doses to help support the system while you're doing the harder work of helping optimize the system over the long term.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Is there any aspect of this that you think we haven't touched on that's important for people to hear?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about contraindications, but not a lot. So when it comes to methylene blue, it's a very safe compound. It's been around since 1897. The FDA put its stamp on it. It's now grandfathered in, and you can get it over the counter. You can get it. You can get it by prescription as well, and still hospitals are using it.
Doesn't it have some distinction as like the first or one of the first prescription drugs ever? Something like that?
The first, yes. The first drug that was registered with the FDA, the first prescription drug. Yeah, absolutely. And so now it's used in hospitals and used in clinical practice all the time. It's still on the World Health Organization's list of essential medications, actually. And this is for cyanide poisoning, which hopefully nobody will get that's listening, but also carbon monoxide poisoning. If you don't have a lot of oxygen around, you don't have a hyperbaric chamber around, this is a very significant remedy for that, because it helps oxygen bind to the hemoglobin molecule in red blood cells better, as opposed to if you didn't have methylene blue around. So it's been around a long time. It's very safe, but there are certain populations that should not take methylene blue. And the major ones are if you're pregnant or breastfeeding. There are some studies that if you're pregnant and taking methylene blue, it could be a teratogen. It can cause deformities in fetus. So don't take it. Breastfeeding is a little more iffy, but probably not. And then also there have been studies that looked at high dose methylene blue and high dose SSRIs, or drugs that block serotonin reuptake, whether it be SSRIs or some of the newer drugs that are combination drugs. And that potentially has a theoretical risk of something called serotonin syndrome. And that is when you get too much serotonin in your synapse, and basically can cause a dysregulation of everything. And people can die from that. But there's only been one report of that in the literature, and it was very, very high dose methylene blue, like something like 40 milligrams per kilogram or something ridiculous like that. Wow. So like very, very high. And so, but as a company, we say that you really need to think about, if you're taking an SSRI drug, you really need to talk to your practitioner before you think about adding it into your regimen. I mean, there are some ongoing studies now using methylene blue as an antidepressant itself. Now, again, it's a derivative of methylene blue because nobody can patent methylene blue itself, but it's being used in studies with depression and bipolar disorder and other mental health issues because we know it has this capacity. But just, that's the major thing to be thinking about is that, and then the other thing is a very high dose methylene blue. If you have a inherited genetic disorder called G6PD deficiency, which is very, very, it's rare, but not terribly rare if you live in like the Mediterranean area, North Africa, Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, et cetera. Very high dose of methylene blue can cause your red blood cells to start breaking. Now, very, very rare. Again, in our dosing, not an issue, but if you're thinking about using higher dose, like greater than 1 milligram per kilogram, it's something to consider before you would start a regimen with a very high dose, at least for even any length of time.
If somebody had G6PD.
Yes, G6PD. Yeah.
Okay,
if you had that, you'd want to make sure you got tested for that.
And people would know if they have that, presumably, most likely.
They may not. No. So that's the thing. So they may not. So because it's not something that may cause an issue. And in most people, actually, it doesn't unless they get very sick for another reason. And so if you are thinking about taking high dose methylene blue for a long period of time, I would get that tested. Yes.
Okay.
It's like if you're going to take high dose IV vitamin C, it's the same thing. People will get checked for G6PD deficiency before you take IV vitamin C at high doses for that same reason. But again, in general, very, very safe across multiple, it's still used in Africa. Now it's coming back as a treatment for malaria, actually, because a lot of the drugs that we now use or have been using are now resistant against, or the malaria is resistant against the drugs itself. So it's coming back for that reason.
Dr. Sherr, there's one thing that I want to make sure we communicate adequately, and that is simply the subjective benefits of using this. So like, what kinds of things are people using this for, and what kinds of results are people seeing as a result of using Methylene Blue?
Yeah, thanks, Ari. I think that's really important. What I said as we were discussing is really the key, and that's just two words: energy and resilience. So people feel more energy and they feel more resilient to day-to-day stressors, operations, whatever it might be. And within that, I'm the head of all the practitioners that use our products at our company. And so I work with all the practitioners that will take our products and use them with their patients. And I've been amazed at some of the things that I've heard, honestly. I mean, sometimes it's symptoms that have been going on for 6 or 8 months from long haul kinds of COVID things with brain fog, fatigue, and they take Methylene Blue in a couple of days, their symptoms are gone or vastly reduced. I have had people with, what it comes down to is that when we're increasing energy production, what are you going to see as a result of that? So you're going to see people's focus get better, their concentration get better, their brain fog get better, their energy overall get better, and so that they feel better in these capacities. But outside of that, I've had people with joint pain go away. I've had people with blood pressure problems see significant improvements. If there's an inflammatory component to a lot of these things, right? And then I've had people, also talking about endurance and like their athletic activities getting better, their recovery scores getting better. Oftentimes people are using Methylene Blue in the mornings because it gives them more energy. But in some people, actually, they're using it before they go to bed because it helps them sleep better, because sleep is not a time when we're just kind of relaxing, and our brains are very highly metabolic, especially during REM sleep. So their REM goes up and their recovery gets better as a result of it. So I think in essence, the way I think about Methylene Blue with the work that I do in clinical practice is like, do my patients need more energy or resilience? The answer is yes. And the question just becomes, when is Methylene Blue something that I could consider using? Is it something I should use now? Should we look at optimizing mitochondrial function a little bit beforehand? But oftentimes it's whether I'm using it before or after a certain technology, which is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Am I using Methylene Blue before? Am I using it after? And how am I using it? Because in almost everybody, I feel like we can say that a part of why they don't feel as well as they want to feel is because their mitochondria aren't working as well as they want them to work, or as they used to work when they were 20 or 30 years of age. And so this is when I think about using in the context of optimizing your health, not just thinking like a simple pill or a compound or a troche in our case is going to make you, feel better for the rest of your life. Like, it really is the context of the nonprofit organization that we have, that we donate money to at Transcriptions at my company, is called Health Optimization Medicine in Practice. This was developed by the same people that developed my company, our company. This is founded also by Dr. Ted Achacoso, who we were talking about before. But the idea is that we're looking to help people through a journey of optimizing their health rather than just treating a disease, looking at foundational biomarkers, vitamins, minerals, nutrients, neurotransmitters, gut health, hormones, and then creating a health optimization plan for patients or clients that creates all of these things in a very holistic way. And then that's when it's best to use things like Methylene Blue, because then you can help support the system while you're doing the hard work of shifting vitamin, mineral, nutrient, hormone networks and things like that. So the context is key. I don't think I have a magic blue pill for everybody, blue troche in my capacity here because of our company. But I do think it could be added to regimens, especially when somebody's on that path to optimizing their health.
Dr. Sherr, this has been a pleasure. Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise with our audience. And the last thing is, where can people learn more about your products?
Yes, thank you, Ari. This has been great. I really appreciate the time and your interest in something since you were 12, Methylene Blue. That's very cool. So you can find more about my company at Transcriptions. It's the word prescription and troche in the opposite capacity, troche and prescriptions combined into the word Transcriptions. And we're on Instagram. We can find us on our website, transcriptions.com. So those are the places.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, my friend. Great catching up with you. I look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise, Ari. Thanks so much.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next